Hi, my name's Alister Chapman, and today I'm at Visual Impact. They have an auction going on right now, selling off a lot of equipment, used equipment that's come in from various different sources. And amongst all of that equipment, there's a few vintage camcorders and some other really interesting bits and pieces. And I have to say that this morning, we've been totally geeking out here, playing with all of this really old stuff. Now, this story goes back a little bit beyond that. So recently I came across a Digital Betacam camcorder on eBay that was being sold very cheaply. And it's a camera that I owned myself for around about 8 to 10 years. So I decided to buy one as a museum piece just to go on a shelf at home. And it arrived, I turned it on, and it actually works. And we'll take a look at that particular camera as we go through the selection of cameras that we've got here. So I've worked in film and television since the late 1980s, and I've used most of these cameras in anger. And one of the really interesting things, one of the fascinating things going through all of this is actually how long some of these cameras were in service. Now, over my right shoulder just here, this is the oldest camera that we've got here. This is a DXC1200 from Sony, and this is circa 1976, something like that. And it's a color tube camera, a single tube, a Trinicon tube. And it's a studio camera, very, very popular camera in its day. This was state of the art. It's very, very big. It's very, very heavy. It weighs a ton. And of course, being a studio camera, it would be recording somewhere else externally. All the other cameras I'm going to show, they're all camcorders, and they can all record internally. So one of the things I did, I'm just going to bring up my laptop here quickly. I created a timeline here of all of these different cameras. And going back to the very beginning of this timeline, we see that we have Betacam from Sony. So Sony introduced Betacam in 1982. And the very first camera, the PVV1, used a single Trinicon tube, the same tube as used in that DXC1200 Studio camera. And that was docked with a recorder called a PVV1. And it was really, really heavy. And it took a while. The BVP1 didn't really catch on. What everybody wanted was this camera here, which is a 3-tube camera, the BVP3. Betacam did get improved. And from Betacam, we went to Betacam SP. So Betacam was Sony's first portable tape format. And although this is a digital Betacam tape, it used a tape very, very similar to this. And these tapes were used, for a huge number of years. In fact, nearly 30 years, tapes using this cassette shell were in production from Sony. And you'll see that as we go through all of these cameras, that almost all of them use this type or very similar tape to this. So one of the very first cameras that I owned was a Betacam SP camcorder. So Betacam SP came after Betacam. The early Betacam cameras were actually very similar size to this. This is Betacam SP. This came out round about 1988. This is what's called a 705 or a 505. And this is an absolute beast of a camera. This thing used to sit on your shoulder, you'd have to shoot with it all day long, and it's really heavy. So it's actually made up of a separate camera head. This is a BVP7, and then a separate recorder. This is a BVV5 Betacam SP recorder. So it's a 2-piece camcorder. We haven't actually turned this one on. We don't have a Paglok adapter to try this one. I don't think it does work though. But this thing, just holding it now, weighs an absolute ton. And this was what I owned initially, and this is where my career really sort of started in film and television as a cameraman, was working with this sort of camera. So things that you should know about these, let me switch cameras, God, this thing is heavy, is they don't play back in color, so they only actually play back in black and white. And you don't have a color viewfinder. The viewfinder LCD, it's not an LCD. It's a cathode ray tube viewfinder. It was very low resolution, around about 250 TV lines. And having used one of these recently, I really struggle to understand how I actually ever got anything in focus and made sure my color balance was correct and all of those things. So this is where it all started for me. This is a beast of a camera, dockable camera and recorder. Now, while we're looking at dockables for a minute, actually, I'm just going to put this one down here out of the way. Betacam kind of had a bit of a resurgence later on. And Sony launched a cheap range of Betacam SP camcorders. So this is actually a DXC1200 camera, and this is docked with a Betacam SP PVV1 Betacam SP recorder. So this was actually a very low cost, or relatively low cost setup. Again, because it's dockable, you could put different recorders on here. And actually, at one point, I had this camera, but I used it with a DVCAM recorder. And we'll come on to DVCAM. We'll talk about DVCAM a little bit later on. But this is actually quite a lot lighter. And this came out in the mid-90s as a low-cost alternative to the full broadcast quality cameras. But they were very, very good. So moving on. So after the dockable camcorders, Sony brought out their one-piece camcorders. And the main one that pretty much everybody had in the Betacam SP world was the BVW-400. Now, unfortunately, we don't have one of those here, but the BVW-400 essentially was a very similar size and shape to this. Recorded Betacam SP, tapes last 30 minutes. They required annual servicing because there's a lot of mechanical stuff in there. And the head drum lasted around about 1,000 hours. And that head drum cost £1,000, roughly, about £3,000 in today's money to replace. So it was an expensive thing to own and run a Betacam SP camcorder. And that annual servicing and everything else, we don't have to worry about that today because everything's solid state. You also got dropouts and glitches because it was an analog system. So if there was a bit of dirt on the tape or something like that, the picture would momentarily glitch and drop out. And that was not all that uncommon, especially if you tried to reuse the tapes. And it was very sensitive. In fact, all of the tape camcorders that we've got here, very sensitive to humidity. So if you had the cold camera into the warm, you'd get condensation on the head drum. That would jam the tape and the camera would stop working. And you'd have to often actually physically take the camera apart to get the tape out and then clean the head drum and everything else. I think we really take for granted today just how reliable modern solid state cameras are compared to these tape ones. So the batteries of the time, which is an NP1 battery, which dropped into a slot in the back, would run it for about 40 minutes, something like that. Or you could get a bigger battery, something like this Paglok battery here, and this would run it for about an hour and a half. Now these were NiCads, so we don't have lithium batteries at this stage. These are NiCad batteries, so they didn't actually last. That the longevity of the battery wasn't that great. You often had to get them resold and things like that. So from there, around about 1994, 93, 94, Sony introduced the Digital Betacam range. And this is my camcorder. This is the one I bought recently. And this is still standard definition. So compared to today, very, very low resolution. And at the time these were launched, these were incredibly expensive. They cost somewhere between half and a third of what the average house cost. So you're looking at sort of £35,000, £40,000 to buy the camera body. Then you'd probably spend another £10,000 on your lens. The viewfinder was on top of all of that. And before you knew it, it was £50,000, £60,000 camera kit, tripod and everything else. So these were phenomenally expensive. They were big, big money. But they lasted for a very long time. So I actually had this one, or when I had one of these, I had this for around about 10 years using this camera. Now the great thing is, this one actually works. So if I turn it on, fire it up, you'll see it will turn on. And it's now on. And actually, let's have a look at the pictures from it. So here we go. So this is the output of this camera. And It's very flary, as you can see, and if I try and get it in focus, somewhere around about there, let's zoom in, focus, zoom out, the old thing that we used to do. You can see the standard definition image. This is a 4:3 camera. There's no 16:9 when this came out, so the aspect ratio is wrong. But and there's Ogie from VI filming me. But there you go, standard definition Digibeta camcorder. And in fact, this will also play back, and there's a tape in it. So if I hit play, you'll see some footage that I recorded with this camcorder. And so this did then play in color. We were finally actually able to play back what we were shooting directly from the camera. And for a lot of news applications and things like that, that was a huge, huge help. But again, it's still a black and white monochrome viewfinder. Low resolution, the viewfinder resolution is really quite low. And I'm surprised actually looking at this again that I ever got anything in focus because the resolution of the camera is so low, so the picture's fairly soft anyway, and then the resolution of the viewfinder is so low, so you're trying to focus a relatively soft image. And we relied very heavily on the peaking function in the camera to make this work. So this is an eBay purchase. Picked it up quite cheaply. It did need a little bit of work to get it going. I've cleaned it up a little bit. I think it was sat in a shed or something for a long time. 2 color filter wheels on the front to get your white balance, your color temperature, and also neutral density correct. Sony standard 2/3 inch B4 lens mount. You got a bunch of switches just in here. And we have these same switches now in pretty much cameras to this day. This really hasn't changed that much. So when you pick one of these up, if you're used to a modern camcorder, you should be fairly familiar with how to make it work. Batteries, again, you're going to be using these big V-mount batteries, but then, or Pagloks. Later on, we did get lithium batteries, and this is a period lithium battery. This is the sort of battery that you would have used with that camera. It's a Sony lithium battery, but these did come much later. And when they did first come out, they were very, very expensive. So Digital Betacam was around for a really long time. And if I go back to my chart, you'll see that Digital Betacam basically ran from around about 1994 and was still in use 2006, 2008. And that, even though the camera costs so much money, the fact that we're still using these tapes for so long, and you could reuse the tapes, it wasn't really recommended, but you could, was a big deal. And the thing that Digital Betacam meant, actually above everything else, was in post-production you could tape-to-tape edit with no loss of image quality. Before you had Digital Betacam, before you had any of the digital tape formats, if you were using Betacam or Betacam SP, in post-production you were copying from the tape to tape in analog, so there was always some loss of quality every time you did that. So in the edit suite and during the edit process, your image quality started to degrade, especially if you had to go more than 1 or 2 generations to add effects and things like that. So Digital Betacam really revolutionized that. And it's a 10-bit 422 format. It's very, very lightly compressed. So in its day, the quality that this gave you really was quite incredible. Now I'm just going to go to my laptop a second, because I do have the original brochure here for one of the cameras, a DVW-790. So these are slightly later cameras. I'll show you one in a second. And what I feel is quite interesting looking at this is that as far as Sony were concerned, these were digital cinema cameras. And these were kind of the beginning of digital cinematography. So we weren't just really using these for news and sports and things like that. They were actually being used for a degree of drama production. And when I worked as an editor and colorist for a while, it was all Digibeta, and we were doing lots of Channel 4 drama series and things like that, all shot on Digibeta. So next on the table here, I'm just going to move this one over. This one here, this is a DNW-9. So the DNW-9 Again, it looks like the Digibeta cameras. And this was Sony trying to really maximize what they could do with this technology, with these recording decks. So the recording decks is pretty much the same from Betacam all the way through to HDCAM. And this is actually an MPEG-2 camera. So you get a lot more on a tape, and it was designed for file-based workflows, even though it's a tape-based camera. So Betacam SX, and then Betacam SX was followed by a very similar but different format called Betacam IMX. And then to round out the digital Betacam era, we have another camera here. This is the 970. And again, very, very similar looking camera. This is notably lighter than the 700, but it's still using the same tapes. It's still a tape-based camera. This is actually, the green tag on here means that this is actually for sale. So if you fancy buying yourself a really nice museum piece, these work, and they're in really good shape actually. This one looks like it's only a couple of years old, when in reality it's about 20 years old. But this was the last of the Digibeta line, because at the same time Sony had released their HDCAM tape range that used very similar tapes to this, but those tapes are recording then in HD. So this is where we started to see a big change, moving from standard definition to high definition. Going back to standard definition, and if I bring up my timeline again for a minute, the transition from standard definition to HD really started around about 2002, 2004. But before then, if we go back to 1998, Sony had cameras for standard definition that weren't these huge, big, heavy camcorders. And they were like the PD100 and PD150. Unfortunately, we don't have one here. But the PD100 essentially was a small tape-based camcorder that you could hold in your hand, and then there was the 150. And this was a big turning point, because suddenly, instead of having to use these big heavy cameras, you could use smaller palm-sized camcorders, much more like what a lot of us are using today. So that was a big change within the industry at that point, moving to these much smaller, lighter, very portable cameras. But very shortly after those arrived on the market, there was a shift to HD. And in fact, some of the cameras that helped with that shift was a camera called the Z1 from Sony, which was another lightweight handheld Handycam, but now this shot on these mini DV tapes, or HDV tapes, like this, basically the same tiny tapes. Let's have a close-up of these teeny tiny tapes instead of the Betacam tapes. So the Betacam tape, and then we went to these tiny tapes. But this could actually shoot in HD and very, very low cost. And that really started to change things. So I've got an example that's representative of that period here. And this is a JVC HD100. And this is one of my collection. And this is an HD camcorder. This is obviously a lot lighter than the Digibeta cameras, and arguably the image quality from this is actually better than the Digibetas, and it was cheaper. Where did we go from there? Now at this point, we start to see interesting cameras come out. So we have HDCAM. We don't have one of those to show. So an HDCAM camcorder is very similar to the Digibeta cameras, using a very similar tape. But we also saw the first optical disc cameras come from Sony. Because one of the problems with shooting HD compared to SD is generally you're creating a lot more data, so you need different ways of doing that. We had a lot of improvements in codecs and compression technology, and one of the first really successful HD lines used for news and things like that was Sony's PDW Optical Disc range. The first camera was the F350. Those cameras weren't on the market for very long. I had one. It was great at the time, but it was quickly replaced by the Sony PDW-700. And this is mine. Let's have a close-up look at this one. So this is the PDW-700 Optical Disc Camcorder. This is an HD camcorder, and it's got this extra box on the side here. This is called a NanoFlash from Convergent Design. And this was an MPEG-2 external recorder. And this allowed you to record onto solid-state media using compact flash cards. The PDW-700 is optical disc. So if I just put a battery on this, so this does work. This does in fact work perfectly. Let's just turn it on. So I'm going to just hit the eject button, and so there's the discs. And in fact, on my website and in my own career, I became quite well known for doing crazy things with these, like putting them in the dishwasher, because that was something that you couldn't do with tape. So we had a very robust format using these discs. So you would hand the disc off at the end of a job, much the same as you would a tape. You'd actually give the disc to the client. The discs are reusable, but generally you handed the disc off. So it was very much like a tape workflow in that you'd shoot and hand the client the tape, but with the convenience of being a file-based workflow. Because one of the things that these tape cameras that were using these mini DV and HDV tapes brought to the market was the ability to offload this footage, whether it was mini DV or perhaps DVCAM, another one of the standard definition formats, using a FireWire cable, kind of an old technology now, but I could transfer the files off this tape onto a computer, and that allowed me to edit my material on a computer. Previously, before we had DVCAM and that ability to offload from the files from the tape, editing on a computer was very, very difficult. The video capture cards were very expensive. You needed a super powerful computer. And most professional editing was done in tape-based edit suites with 2-3 machine editing. And that was phenomenally expensive. I think when I was doing it, it was being charged at around about £100 an hour. So you're looking at £800 to £1,000 a day to hire this edit suite. And of course, this is 20 years ago. So in today's money, you're looking at £2,000 or £3,000 a day for your edit time. When computer editing with DVCAM came along, that price crashed because you could edit that at home on a reasonably priced computer with Adobe Premiere, and then we had Avid and things like that coming along for offline and online editing. So with the optical disc camera, you kind of had the advantages of both worlds. You shot on the disc, you could hand the disc off to the client, but at the same time I could plug a FireWire cable into the back of the camera here, and I could offload the footage onto a computer over FireWire, and that made editing and post-production very low cost, very cheap, very easy, and you could do a lot more in terms of special effects and things like that in a computer than you could do in a tape-to-tape edit suite. So that's PDW-700. And around the same time as the PDW-700 came out, there was another Sony camera, we don't have one here unfortunately, called the EX1. And this was a 1/2-inch 3-chip Handycam. But now this moves to solid state media. So this is a very early S by S card. So it's a solid state card from Sony, S by S media. Now when these first came out, this is an 8GB card. One of these cards was about £300 or £400 for an 8GB card. At the time, these were very, very fast, very, very robust, and very, very reliable. And this media ended up being used in a whole line of Sony cameras from that EX1 onwards. Now the thing about the EX1 was it actually offered virtually broadcast quality images in a low-cost Handycam camcorder with an entirely file-based workflow that was very fast. And that really changed everything. So even optical disc didn't last all that long compared to this. Initially, a lot of people didn't want to move to entirely file-based because they didn't really like the workflow where you didn't give these to the client because they were too expensive. It meant that at the end of your day of shooting, you offloaded the footage and you gave the footage to the client on a hard drive or a couple of hard drives. And initially, there was a lot of reluctance to do that. A lot of mistakes got made, files got lost. But eventually, that type of workflow became normal, and that's what we do today. We shoot on SD cards, compact flash cards, CF Express cards, and we offload the footage and we don't give the client the original files, we give them a copy. But it took a while for this to really catch on, but when it did, it changed everything. And optical disc I'm not sure how many years these were on sale for. I think I had my camera for about 4 years. Was relatively short-lived because everything moved to file-based with cameras like Sony's F55, then the FS7, and now we have today's current cameras, the FX6, and all of those, and they're all now file-based. So taking a slight sideways journey for a moment, around about 2012 and 2014, we had 3D. 3D became this huge thing and everybody wanted to make 3D movies and shoot in 3D. And to accommodate that, Sony even created a 3D camcorder, and they've actually got one here at Visual Impact. Now, at the time when this came out, I really, really wanted one of these. I was doing a lot of 3D production with a beam splitter 3D rig. And this is a PMW-TD300. And it's kind of based on some of the cameras of that time. There was a PMW-300, very similar looking camera, mostly looking like this. But of course, the interesting thing about this is it has 2 lenses. So it can shoot 3D, so shoots stereoscopic. And again, this is here at Visual Impact. If you really, really want one, maybe talk to Visual Impact, but I'm not sure that this is actually going to be sold because it's such a unique museum piece. And it really is a great shame that a lot of these cameras are disappearing forever, never to be seen again. So that's the PMW-TD300, a 3D camcorder. So I hope you've enjoyed this little run through history from basically from when I started working in this industry to where I am now. I think it's really interesting to actually see these old cameras. I mean, this PDW-700 is HD camera, so it still outputs a pretty good and usable image. And I'll probably end up actually still using this for the odd thing where I just need an extra HD camera with that 2/3 inch zoom lens. I was really pleased to find that the BVW-700 Betacam, Digital Betacam, worked. If anybody comes across a Sony EX1 that they would like to sell or donate to me to add to my collection, I would really like to get my hands on a Sony EX1. It's a camera I had for many, many years. It was sold to buy a Sony F3, I think. But I'd really like to have an EX1 in my collection because it was a pivotal time in my career. If you do have any questions, go to my website, xdcam-user.com, and I can try and answer them there. So thank you for watching. So I've just finished my video on these old cameras and we're just packing up, and Andy here, who's been at Visual Impact since day one, has just made my day because he's actually donated his weight that he uses for testing tripods to me. So it's a BVP7 with a BVV5 back. Although this isn't the camera that I actually owned, it's the same make and model. And I actually, when I bought mine 30 years ago, bought it from Visual Impact. And at that time, Visual Impact were operating out of some garages just around the corner from here. And their speciality was buying used kit and making that kit available at affordable prices so that people like myself at that time, working on tiny budgets, could actually get their hands on very usable, very workable equipment. And of course, that's what VI still do today, and that's what's still happening right now. So they've recently purchased a lot of equipment from several companies that have gone bankrupt, and that's now available for you to buy. There's an auction ongoing right now at the time of making this film. But that's how I got into this industry, was by having secondhand gear at an affordable price. And that's what VI are really good at doing. So thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you, Alister.
Thank you.